Welcome back and welcome to part 2 of classical Pavlovian conditioning. So let's go through some basic steps and phenomena in classical conditioning. First is acquisition. So acquisition, you can basically substitute the word learning for acquisition. So this is the period of time in which you acquire the conditioning or learn the conditioning association between your conditioned stimulus and your unconditioned stimulus. So let's say, for example, we're using the metronome and pairing that with food. And you can think of on our x-axis would be the number of pairings, the number of times we present the metronome, followed by the food. This is our sort of acquisition or learning phase. You can see that at first the metronome itself on the first trial produces very little salivation, but then on the second trial it produces more salivation. Then on the third trial, more salivation. On the fourth trial, even more salivation. Fifth trial, more salivation. Sixth trial, more. And then you get to a point where you reach what we call asymptotic sort of association, which means that it's not really getting much higher or lower. It's reaching an asymptote, which you can kind of draw here, which is essentially the maximum amount of responding that you would anticipate. So as you probably would have predicted, it doesn't go off into infinity. You don't get to a point where you're just salivating by thousands and thousands of drops of saliva due to the conditioning before. You essentially reach a highest level possible. And that highest level possible is actually determined by the reflex that is underlying this. So for example, the maximum amount of salivation that you can get produced by the conditioned stimulus, which would be the metronome, is going to be the same as the maximum amount of salivation that you could get by the food that you are pairing that with alone. If you are pairing food that produce more salivation, like say something sour, then you would get more drops. If you were pairing with something that is not sour, you would get fewer drops. So it's completely dependent on the CS-US relationship, the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response relationship. That reflex response is important, but the CS will continue to pick up conditioning power until it essentially produces the same level of responding that the unconditioned stimulus would. That is our asymptote. So here's an example that we've used in one of our studies in our lab. We are conditioning a tone. And let me make sure that I am sharing sound. Conditioning a tone to a feeder. So there's nothing going on. Dog is walking around. Air pump sound in the background. Tone goes off. Like, hey, what's that tone? But clearly it's not producing anything in particular. Interest, and the feeder goes. More conditioning. Now, after we do a few trials, see there's more just general response towards the feeder area. Tone turns on, looks at the tone, straight at the feeder, and we have a conditioned response right there, which is approaching and staring at the feeder. This is Pavlovian conditioning. None of these behaviors are required by the dog. They're just doing them because of a previous learned association between that tone and the unconditioned stimulus of food coming. So as you can see, that was the beginning. Here would be probably close to asymptotic levels of conditioned responding. And we don't need to measure salivation. We can see very clear behavioral changes that are in addition to purely salivation changes. So the conditioned response magnitude and the unconditioned stimulus relationship is quite important. If the unconditioned stimulus is greater in magnitude, the conditioned response will also be greater. You should know this, hopefully, as the law of reflex, the law of magnitude. So as the magnitude of your unconditioned stimulus increases, the magnitude of your reflexive response will as well. So for example, if you have like one little piece of food and a big piece of food, so if you have just a little tiny piece of food, you produce a certain amount of salivation. If you have more greater magnitude unconditioned stimulus, you produce more unconditioned responding. And because of that, that same relationship will inherent when you're doing classical conditioning. So this bell or metronome will produce this similar amount, the asymptotic level of sort of conditioned responding or salivation here. But here, because our unconditioned stimulus produces a lot more unconditioned response, we would also expect that our bell would pick up this maximum asymptotic level of salivation. So you would get more salivation in the bottom case than you would in the top case. So Pavlovian extinction, these learned associations are not permanent. They are constantly changing, and they can be changed based off of the current conditions that are in effect. So if you repeatedly present the conditioned stimulus alone until it no longer comes to elicit the conditioned response, you will eventually see declines of that respondent behavior to baseline levels. In other words, the conditioned stimulus will stop eliciting that conditioned response. So this is what it looks like graphically. So I just showed you before what acquisition looks like, then the asymptote, and then if we stop presenting the US with the CS, so say you're just presenting the metronome and never any food, or with the tone that I had, I stopped presenting the tone, you would see behavior decline significantly. However, it will come back. There's a phenomenon called spontaneous recovery. So if you just give a delay, say 24 hours, come back, you will anticipate that responding will return or increase again on its own. It won't be as high as it used to be, but it will return quite substantially by itself, which will then again extinguish. Spontaneous recovery will keep happening. So you'll again see some more recovery, but eventually after you keep running extinction over and over again, spontaneous recovery will stop happening. Another important and key factor in Pavlovian conditioning is the timing and association and timing between your conditioned stimulus and your unconditioned stimulus. So there are different forms of classical conditioning. First one is what we call simultaneous conditioning. This is when the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus onset and offset both at the same time. So this is, say, a tuning fork or a tone or a metronome. It starts at the same time food starts and ends at the same time the food is consumed. We can have it offset slightly differently, where we have delay conditioning, where the conditioned stimulus starts first, so bell, then your unconditioned stimulus comes about. So now think about the example that I just had with the dog that I was showing you with the tone and the food. What type was that? Was that simultaneous conditioning or was that delay conditioning? Another type of conditioning is going to be trace, and that is where you have essentially a gap in timing between the CS onset and offset. Oops, that's not really good offset. Offset between the two stimuli. So this would be, say, for example, beep, gap, food. So there's a substantial gap. That gap can be quite small, but it just means that the conditioned stimulus is not durational, that is staying on such that it is overlapping the unconditioned stimulus. And then finally, we can actually have backwards conditioning, where the food comes, then your conditioned stimulus. So it would be giving the food, then playing the metronome, or giving the food, then playing the beep. As you can imagine, probably that there's substantial differences in the effectiveness of these different types of procedures. So which do you think would be the most effective? Well, this is the actual answer. Delay conditioning is the most effective. And the reason for that is because the reason why we have Pavlovian conditioning is evolutionary, right? Because it serves a purpose, which means that it's important to know what things in your environment can come and predict what other biologically relevant things are about to come. So it's very useful to know what things predict whether food is going to be available or not, so you know how to appropriately allocate your resources and energy. So with conditioned stimuli that come and tell us when food is about to come, it's most useful if that stimulus tells us right before the unconditioned stimulus comes. If it happens at the same time as the unconditioned stimulus, then it's not really giving us any information, is it? It's just happening at the same time. So if a bell and food were coming at the exact same time, why pay attention to the bell? Because the food is giving you that same amount of information. However, if the bell comes right before to let you know that dinner time is coming, now that bell is useful. That bell is providing you with information that's telling you that get ready, food is about to come. So delay conditioning by far tends to be the most effective in terms of producing conditioned responding. Then comes trace. It really depends on how long this gap is. If this gap is minimal, then it really looks basically the same as delay conditioning. However, if you have a substantial gap in time, then trace can become substantially less effective. Simultaneous is going to produce some conditioning, but as I said, it really doesn't produce a lot of information that is useful to the animal or ourselves. If I was going to, present to you with food and a stimulus that predicts food at the same time, well, that stimulus is not really predictive if it's coming at the same time. You may as well just wait until the food comes rather than pay attention to what that stimulus happens to be. And the same goes for backwards conditioning. This is the least effective in the sense that it doesn't give you any real predictive information of what's about to come because the US has already come. So now why do you even care about this arbitrary bell stimulus that's happening in your environment if you've already gotten the food? So in fact, it's actually really hard a lot of times in animals to get backwards conditioning at all. So delay tends to produce the most. Then we get intermediate conditioning. Trace really depends on how long that trace is. If the trace is short, then it's going to look more like delay. If it's long, it's going to look more like simultaneous. And then least to no conditioning occurs with backwards. So this brings up another question, is for those of you who have participated or played around with training dogs for scent work or nose work, perhaps a lot of you know about this concept of what trainers talk about all the time is rewarding at source. In other words, making sure that the food comes from the location that the odor is coming from. And in reality, if you think about, well, where does this sort of fit in the chart? And the answer is it probably depends on how strong your odor is. If your odor is very weak and that your food odor is really, really strong, perhaps what's happening here is that they're actually using something like backwards conditioning or perhaps simultaneous conditioning where the dog recognizes the conditioned stimulus and food presence at the exact same time. Or if the food smell is stronger, they recognize and detect food first, then the odor that you're trying to pair that with might produce backwards or simultaneous conditioning, but most likely probably doesn't produce either delay or trace conditioning unless the smell is much stronger by your conditioned stimulus than your unconditioned stimulus. So this would suggest or perhaps predict that in many cases, trying to train a dog to detect a new odor by pairing it with food may actually be less effective overall. And actually, we did a study like this back in forever ago now, 2013, where essentially we were training dogs to detect which of these two buckets has an odor in it that we want them to find and to alert to. We either did it one way, in which we buried food in the two buckets, and that the one with accessible food that they could eat contained an odor pad in here, and this one didn't contain an odor pad. Whereas this setup is basically identical, but we just kept food out of the system so that they didn't have to also have sort of that food in the bin in and of itself. And what we found was that when the dogs had the odor delivered by the food delivered by the experimenter and was trained on a particular odor, they learned that substantially faster than they learned any of the other comparisons. And in particular, the odor where we had the food buried, which is this dashed line, they went up and down and where by the end of it, we're substantially better when the experimenter delivered the food than when we were trying to pair it at source, indicating that probably what's happening when you pair it at source, depending on how concentrated your odor is something like simultaneous or perhaps backwards conditioning, which could be a much slower type of learning than if they were just learning an association of I smell the odor and then the person gives me food, so that it becomes more like delay conditioning. Okay, so I want to take another break there, end this up, and then we will pick back up with, well, what does the CS mean, or what does the CS become?